Okay, this video is going to go over exercise 2B, which is going to be body cavities. So we're going to be taking a look at this one right now, body cavities. We are on page 4 of the labeling handout. So if you remember, your labeling handout is going to look like this. And we just got done in the previous video talking about the esophagus and the trachea. So now we're on 2B, which is going to be the body cavities. So you've got this handout right here. We're at the bottom of page 4. So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at the body cavities and the organs that are located within them. So do you see this image here? This image, or this image here that you have on your handout, is going to be the image or something very, very similar that you're going to see on the test. So what I'll do on the test is I will put a question mark. If I give you this image, let's say, I'd put a question mark in one of these boxes and ask you to tell me, what body cavity is that? So that's how that question is going to look on the test. So we're going to go through each of these body cavities. So first of all, we're just going to really define the two. We're going to go from like broad to specific. So the first body cavity we're going to take a look at is labeled A, and this is going to be the dorsal cavity. Remember, dorsal means back. So this is the body cavity that's on the back of the person. And it's going to be represented in green in the image that you see. So it's going to include this area up here and this area right down through here. All of that's green. So that whole thing is going to be called the dorsal cavity. Now, the ventral cavity is going to be what's on the front. Remember, that's what ventral means, and that's going to be labeled B. And it is all of this beige color. All of that is going to be the ventral cavity. Look at your bracket here and where it goes. Okay, it goes through all that. So that lets you know, okay, that's the ventral cavity. Now, what do you find inside the dorsal cavity? Well, the dorsal cavity is then subdivided into two smaller cavities, the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. So the cranial cavity is going to be labeled C on your handout, your labeling handout, and then the spinal cavity or vertebral cavity is going to be labeled D on that handout. You need to know what organs are found in each of those cavities. So I've got those represented in italics. So the cranial cavity is going to house the brain. Question on the test could be name the cavity or name the organ found within this cavity. Okay, so you're going to have to read the question. And then the spinal cavity could be tagged, and I could say name the cavity, or I could say name the organ that's found within this cavity. And the organ that's found within the cavity would be the spinal cord. So again, letter C is the cranial cavity on your handout. Letter D is the spinal cavity on your handout. Now, let's take a look at the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity is divided by this physical barrier right here. It's a little bit darker beige, right? Called the diaphragm. The diaphragm divides the ventral cavity into the upper thoracic cavity and the lower abdominopelvic cavity. So on your handout there, let me pick a different color here. On your handout, the thoracic cavity is labeled letter E, and the abdominopelvic cavity is going to be labeled letter F. So what organs are you going to find within the thoracic cavity? Okay, well, that's going to be the heart and lungs. That's why they're in italics over here. So again, letter E is going to be the thoracic cavity. Letter F is going to be the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity is then subdivided into two separate categories or two separate cavities. And it is separated by this imaginary white dotted line that's down here. No, you don't really have an imaginary white dotted line in your body. You have a diaphragm, right? But you don't have this imaginary white dotted line. So that is going to separate it into the abdominal cavity, which is above that imaginary white line. This is going to be letter G on your labeling handout. And then the lower portion, which is your pelvic cavity, that's going to be letter H on your labeling handout. Sorry, I had to find my little mouse there for a minute. So above that white dotted line is just going to be the abdominal cavity. Below the white line is just going to be the pelvic cavity. Now, what is actually there that you could separate that? Actually, the bladder is what's in around that location. So a lot of times it's everything bladder and below is pelvic. Everything above the bladder, but below the diaphragm, is going to be the abdominal cavity. Okay, so let's look at the abdominal cavity, which is going to be letter G again on your labeling handout. So it's everything above the bladder, but below the diaphragm. That's going to be the abdominal cavity. You're going to find things in there such as a lot of your digestive stuff, honestly, your stomach, your liver, your small intestines, kidneys, which are going to be very ventral, uh, and then part of your appendix, part of the large intestine, a lot of digestive stuff. Now, the pelvic cavity, which is going to sit urinary bladder and below. So this white dotted line is representing the location thereabouts of the urinary bladder. So urinary bladder and below is going to be part of that pelvic cavity. And what are you going to find there? Well, definitely part of your large intestine, right? The very last segment of the large intestine where it's going to exit the body, the bladder for sure, and all of the female and male reproductive structures. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now, this is a little bit different of a look here. It's flipped and I've got numbers instead of letters there, but you should be able to identify those body cavities based on this image as well. And that's going to be on the Moodle page for you to work on. Okay, so we're going to stop there and we will pick up our next video talking about serous membranes.